Journalists and media pundits have been pushing out headlines highlighting alarming spikes in crime across the country, from homicides, shootings, carjackings, and armed robberies. Now, some say these sensationalized headlines are scare tactics to force wealthy residents, mostly white, with political clout and politicians eager to please them to claw back past and alleged ongoing police reform efforts. Do the weeks and weeks of reports about rising crime rates reflect reality, or are they mere fiction designed to advance a conservative agenda ahead of the midterm elections this year? Experts weigh in, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Whether you live in Los Angeles or New York, you can't turn on the television or pick up your newspaper without hearing or seeing some story about crime, whether it's a high-profile murder or a smash and grab robbery at a street of luxury department stores. They're crime stories that are dominating the news cycle. Some folks are starting to ask, are these stories being purposefully placed during this time period to raise alarm, to cause folks to stop thinking and talking about and actually engaging in the process of police reform? Remember, after George Floyd, all of the police departments, all of the work that was being done by social justice activists around the country, the cities, the mayors, the city council, all the people who were talking about reforming police departments, doing more training, reallocating resources from police budgets to health and human services and mental health departments. It seems like all of those efforts, and at least the conversation about those efforts, has taken a back seat and the narrative has shifted. This narrative shift is even affecting progressive district attorneys who were elected in the last elections, many of whom now face recall efforts, like the district attorney in the city of Los Angeles and the one in New York City. Both of those former prosecutors who said they weren't going to prosecute low-level nonviolent crimes, that they were going to look differently at how cases were prosecuted, how prosecutors were requesting jail time. Those prosecutors are now under attack. They're being called soft on crime, and we're starting to hear that language more and more, soft on crime. So today we're asking, are these headlines true, or is all of this just fantasy to scare you, to make people so afraid that they vote for candidates who are committed to maintaining the status quo? My first guest is Cecil Rhambo. He is the chief of police at the Los Angeles airport, and he's a candidate for the Los Angeles sheriff, which that election is coming up in just a couple of months. Good morning and welcome, Cecil.
Good morning, Areva. Thank you for having me.
Okay, Chief Rhambo, you saw the article about the 17 separate gang organizations, outfits that allegedly are following home wealthy people in Los Angeles to rob them. This article, clearly shocking. I had several people send it to me. I had friends from New York even who read the article send it to me. And the question I'm asking today is, how much of that article is reality? How much of it is written for the purposes of justifying the Los Angeles Police Department's effort to restore its numbers, to hire on more police departments? It just feels like to me it's very difficult in this moment to get trusted information about what crime is and isn't, particularly in a big city like Los Angeles.
Well, I think that there's a little bit of truth to what you're saying. However, I've been in this business for 36 years and have investigated crimes like this in the past. So we've seen these kinds of crime patterns. Typically in the past, it's been following people from the casinos and other places, but now you're starting to see it in the more affluent areas. And quite shockingly, in the middle of the day, like the video of the woman getting run over as she was running from her assailants. I don't think that's hyperbole or fantasy. Those are real incidents that are happening to real people. Clarence Avant's wife. I mean, that's a real incident. So I don't think it's necessarily intentionally shocking. I think what's shocking is the fact that it's happening in communities that it didn't normally happen in. As far as the Los Angeles Police Department trying to justify their existence, law enforcement doesn't really necessarily, in my personal opinion, need to justify our existence. What we do like to do is really point out what are the real concerns. So when we bring things like this to the public, we want people to be aware, one, of their surroundings, aware of what's going on, not to be paranoid, but also to be alert to what's happening. I can tell you that I've looked at studies over the years. For instance, New York has 40,000 budgeted officers, many more, thousands more than here in LA. More cops don't always lead to less crime. And I think even though we're moving away from the narrative about police reform and social or criminal justice reform, behind the scenes, we're still talking in that manner. I just met yesterday with PV Jobs, for instance, in terms of how do we get our formerly incarcerated or our incarcerated folks into jobs as they come out. So that discussion is still happening. It's just not it's being kind of drowned out by the sensationalism and the violence that you're seeing now.
So I want to unpack a couple of things that you said, Chief Rhambo. One is you said crime is now happening in wealthy neighborhoods. And yes, we know that most crime in big cities like LA, New York, Chicago happens in poor neighborhoods. And again, are we, all up in arms about this crime because now it's moved into, in LA's case, Beverly Hills? Because now, how dare these criminals decide to go steal, $5,000 handbags or $20,000 watches in Beverly Hills? But there's crime that's happening in poor neighborhoods all the time. So are police now more attuned to the crime because wealthy people are impacted?
I don't believe so. I think that I've policed everything from Malibu to Willowbrook and Compton. And you're right, in the inner city, in the more disadvantaged communities, there's a lot of just day-to-day normal crime that's considered almost normal. But it's not these folks that are being literally run over by cars as they're being chased down by, suspects. I think what's shocking and what's important to really look at here is this little, I think it's starting to be like the appearance that society is really slipping into much more chaotic anarchy.
That's how it's being spun in the media.
Right.
But if you live in a poor Black community, you have become you've adjusted to a certain level of crime. And yes, if you're going to focus on that woman that's being chased by a car, there are Black people in communities all the time who face crime and live in crime-ridden communities. And I think a part of this message is saying that somehow those people are more important. And when they experience crime, the world, at least the police department, needs to respond to it in a different way. And that may not be the intention, but that definitely is one of the unintended consequences of how this crime is being portrayed in the media. And something else you said, the police doesn't have to justify itself. Well, I don't know, I take exception with that. We were having conversations about shifting budgets and huge sums of money away from police departments. Those conversations were happening just last summer. So there was a need for police to justify why they needed the level of funding that they were receiving, as we were seeing some city councils vote to take some of their funding away and to put it into other places like community services. So I'm not sure that that's a true statement that police do have to justify why their budgets are so inflated.
Well, I'll say this. I can tell you that as we move into criminal justice reform and moving budgetary dollars to community-based services, what I've seen over the years, particularly I worked in the AB 109 prison realignment reform execution of that out into the community, is that there was discussion about robust programs, but the programs and the housing and the alternative housing just didn't materialize. So what happens is law enforcement still has to respond to the mentally ill, still has to respond to the homelessness issue. And so while we are certainly in favor of having other people respond to these issues, it never materialized. And so we're still the 24/7 response team. So the unfortunate part of that, it has to be done, it has to be executed completely before we actually can reallocate those dollars. And it has to really equate to alternatives that are realistic. I mean, right now, what's going on is the cops still have to respond to these things. But also to your point, when I look at something like someone being chased down in the middle of the day in Beverly Hills or wherever that incident was, that is just, you don't see that. I've never even seen that really in Compton or Willowbrook or any of these
Well,
other
what's the difference, Chief? It doesn't matter if you're chased down or if your kid has to walk through a gang-infested neighborhood and you're afraid that they're going to get beat up. I mean, we can talk about the degrees, but I don't. If I'm a poor Black person in a Compton, I don't care that white woman's being chased by a car. If my kid can't walk safely to school, I'm not sure there's a difference that makes a difference.
Well, the difference is that we've never, so in Compton pays for its, they contract for their own law enforcement there. They pay for the sheriff.
And I don't mean Compton literally. I'm just using.
Yeah, let's take Watts. Let's take an area where crime has traditionally happened, where I grew up, perhaps where you grew up. Law enforcement has always been a presence there. And so I get your point saying that why is it more important now that it's happening in areas where people don't normally experience those things? I think it's important because as we move forward into the future, we're hoping and we're praying literally that people are getting jobs, that they're being allowed some reform measures so they don't have to revert to these types of actions. People that do crimes like that, I think they need, there's a little more than rehab, because what's really going on? What makes you think that it's okay to commit these kinds of crimes anywhere? Doesn't matter where they are. So I think there's a whole narrative that needs to take place around just how we are as a society as a whole.
Yeah, there's some things about that article too that I felt were missing from the article. One, it seemed to be placing the blame on the prosecutor for letting people out who had been arrested, and this narrative that somehow the prosecutor wasn't being hard enough on these criminals. I didn't hear a lot, though, about what the police were doing. Like, I didn't hear about gang intervention and some of the strategies to catch kids before they get into gangs. It didn't talk at all about that. So you already said, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, more police officers on the street doesn't equate to less crime, because you identified New York City, 40,000 officers. Is that what you said? How many police are in New York?
There's about 40,000, yes.
And then we all just witnessed what happened yesterday on a train in New York with the subway, the shooting, 11 people. So where's the conversation that doesn't resort to lock people up, put more officers on the street? That just seems to be the default go-to whenever we have these conversations about crime. So we keep doing the same thing over and over again. Like, so, locking up Black and brown people, stealing watches and purses, going to be the epidemic that we saw in the 80s, where we were locking the, people, Black and brown people up for crack cocaine and giving them 20 years. Is that what we want to see happen to these people?
No, I think, look, when you go into violence, when you're actually going to actually hurting people, I think that raises the antenna of everybody. It shocks the conscience. As I mentioned before, there are people, I'm talking about police reforms and really not arresting our way out of crime by literally meeting yesterday with PV Jobs and working with Workforce Investment Board and transitional subsidized employment. Those kinds of discussions are happening. And if you elect a person like me or people who are really reform-minded, we can still do both. We can arrest folks that need it. We can target gang members that are doing these kinds of things. But we can also stop the school to pipeline, prison pipeline. We can also get people back into jobs and housing as they're coming out of custody. So that discussion is happening. But right now, that's not as sexy as what we see happening in the streets right now.
Yeah, and that's sad, because even though, and I applaud you for having those conversations that you said you are having behind the scenes, the narrative that's resonating with people is the scare. We've heard one of our mayoral candidates say everybody in LA, no matter where you live, is scared to walk out their door. And the LA Times challenged that candidate on that, Rick Caruso, and they went and they talked to people in neighborhoods, and people said, no, that's not the case. I'm not afraid to walk out of my door. I'm more concerned about these gas prices and the price of food in a grocery store. Yes, crime is real. And you mentioned Jackie Avon. I'm friends to Clarence and the late Jackie Avon, and my heart, just bled for them. That was a horrible, horrible murder. And I'm not suggesting that hardened criminals or criminals or people, offenders who commit violent crimes, we don't have a way to deal with them in this country other than locking them up. So yeah, we got to lock them up. But it feels like to me in this moment that we have lost our way and we've shifted the focus, and we're back to that kind of 1980s Ronald Reagan, even goes back to Richard Nixon, law and order. And if you're not in favor of giving somebody long prison sentences, you are, quote unquote, soft on crime. So we're having that really binary, distorted conversation. You are law and order or you're soft on crime. And that's doesn't get us very far, because we've been here before and it hasn't gotten us very far.
I think if we keep folks in such as yourself, talking about it in this aspect, I think it's very healthy to have this conversation. And again, having folks who've been in the experience that I've had, where I've worked with reforms, and I've also worked I used to command all of gang operations for LA County and work with Charlie Beck on the GRID programs, and really driving down some high levels of gang violence, 20 years ago. But I think we need to do both. Are you seeing those gang interventions? Like I said, the article didn't mention it. And I know you don't work for LAPD, but are those kinds of gang intervention happening? Those strategies, are they being, deployed as we speak? Or is it just blame the prosecutor for letting folks out and try to scare half the Los Angeles with those kinds of articles? But is there anything happening? Yeah, there are things going on. I mean, I just met with Second Call also. So, with Skip Townsend over there. So those things are still happening. And so behind the scenes is going on, but you're right. The narrative
is Skip talking to those 17 gangs identified in that article?
Well, I hadn't talked to him about that, but I talked to him about how we could work together if I'm elected sheriff. But, the reality is those efforts are still ongoing. They're out there happening. But the news isn't picking that up because it's not as appealing to, it's not sensational enough. If it bleeds, it leads, right? I mean, so a woman on video getting run over by some people in the broad daylight and then her watch stolen, that's going to get the news. I mean, that's going to get attention.
You're right. Not your fault. Thank you for having those conversations behind the scenes and working with Skip Townsend and gang intervention and those folks who are coming out of incarceration. I appreciate you sitting down with me and sharing your insights on this issue. My next guest is Cedric Alexander. He is a veteran law enforcement expert. He's worked in several police departments around the country. He's also the author of In Defense of Public Service. And Cedric has served on a national commission to study crime and study criminal reforms. Welcome back, Cedric. As you can tell, I'm a little frustrated because these crime stories are driving me crazy. And one thing is becoming clear to me, Cedric, there's money in crime. So how do we trust any of these statistics? We got the bail bondsman industry saying the problem is you guys did away with cash bail and you're letting these hardened criminals back out on the street. You have the cops saying, we told you. You use the word defund the police and you caused our morale to, fall to an all-time low, and cops quit. And now we need our money back to get our, officers back on the street. So who do you believe when you read these numbers?
Well, first of all, let me say this. It's great to see you again, Areva. So unfortunately, we have to see each other under these type of circumstances. But it is really great to see you. So let me start by saying this, and I think my track record. I've been talking about this stuff as a former chief twice in this country for a number of years now, and a lot of my consulting work, a lot of my writing, whether it's in the Washington Post or some op-ed or whatever the case may be, is always about how we can do better, particularly around this era that we refer to, or have referred to as police reform. I think there's so many things post George Floyd that have occurred that just have totally gotten us off track. One, if we begin to break down some of the things that you were just talking about, even we talk about defunding police, you and I know that term got politicized.
Right.
And it got politicized that it changed an election in this country, by the way, as well. But we're at this point in this country is that locals themselves, regardless of what community they're in, is going to have to take care of these crime issues themselves, because clearly it's not coming from the federal government. You had the right and the left who could not get together and provide any type of George Floyd reform for this nation to have some basis to operate off of. So communities, many of them are doing the very best that they can, but it still calls for accountability by people who are local, whether they're in LA or in my hometown of Pensacola, wherever it may happen to be. Now, when you start talking about these statistics of these crimes, of these gangs that are following people home, blah, 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 one of the things I would ask that citizens very much ask their police department locally, whatever community, is to provide the data, show us the data where these events are taking place. How do you read this data? What does it mean to you? How are you all fighting against this? What tools are being used? Because when you put out that 19 different gangs, which would take a lot of coordination.
Well, actually it's 17, and they say they're totally unrelated. And I'm thinking, like, who are these 17 gangs in South LA? And if you can identify the gangs, why can't you stop the activity?
Yeah. So regardless, whatever the number is, and if they all have somehow coordinated together that they're going to rip people off, then yeah, they got a serious problem. But I also think that the public needs to ask more specific questions. Right. How long has this been going on? Who you identified as suspects? How many victims are there? What are some of the patterns of this? We need more information around that. And that's just being a good citizen. That's not challenging police. That's just being a good citizen. Because you want to make sure in this political climate that we're in, that none of this is being politicized. Because there are police officers out there that are truly trying to do a good job, and they themselves don't want to be politicized. So I think we have to ask some of those tough questions to leadership in policing across this country, and more specifically in your community there in LA.
No, those are great questions, and the article doesn't answer those questions. And we did reach out to the Los Angeles Police Department, Public Relations Department, to get some of those answers that they haven't answered yet, but hopefully we will get them. But just in general, Cedric, the FBI compiles crime statistics, but we know there are 18,000 different police forces around this
country.
Are they required by some law to report their crimes into the FBI?
Well, they all are supposed to report into the Uniform Crime Report of the FBI. I can't recall, since I've been away from it, whether it's required or not, but most of your state agencies will, and the state get their information oftentimes from the locals. So that information usually is there, but that is not the issue here. The bigger issue here around crime is this, and you were talked about this at the top of your show. We're not talking about reform, we're talking about crime. Yes, crime is on the uptick. In fact, it was on the uptick prior to COVID. It was exacerbated by COVID, but COVID is not the reason for it. We have deeper systemic issues that, you talked about ad nauseum on your show, as it relates to poverty, poor education, lack of health care, lead poisoning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the real driving issues around crime that is continuing to exacerbate itself in our society. And you overlaid that with COVID and all that came with that. It certainly did create a dynamic, but here's the thing. In all of that, we were still coming off of, or still very much involved in post-George Floyd anxiety across this country, and people are still in it, by the way. And all this kind of get lost. So yes, the judicial system is going to have to go back and revisit some of the leniency that has been imposed on violent criminals. Look, it can't be too far to the right when it comes to reform, but it also can't be too far to the left, because at the end of the day,
Cedric, what have you seen to the left? I think again, that's been sensationalized. I don't see any district attorneys around the country letting out violent criminals. I think what these reform district attorneys have done is to say we're going to look at nonviolent criminals and figure out a way to end this mass incarceration and to criminalize misdemeanor type offenses.
And we're all in agreement with that. And this is where you have to be very careful here in the language, because this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking violent criminals themselves, who I know for a fact that are being also released under these new reforms. That cannot be allowed, right? So we can't be so far to the right on this thing where we keep people locked up for misdemeanors for months on end in jail. That's wrong, because they can't make $100 bond. But at the same time, we can't go so far to the left either, where felony, not misdemeanor, felonies, violent felonies, carjackings, assault, shootings, etc., are released back on the street with little or no bond. This is what, of course, now your bail bonds people are referring to, because yes, it is a certain level of selfishness in that involved. Certainly it is, but at the same time, there's a level of truth to it as well too, because we cannot allow these violent felons back on the street. You don't want that. I don't want that. And I don't care whether you sit on the right side or left side of the aisle. No one wants that. So some of these things are going to have to be revisited, such as in the state of New York, for an example. Every chief, every sheriff in that state, and I know a bunch of them, and they will tell you this thing is really hurting us in our communities because we're seeing violent criminals being released back on the street. But I don't want to totally spend my time talking about that. I think we get that. The piece here is around reform. We don't hear the language. Nobody appears to be talking about it. But these incidents are continuing to occur, i.e. yesterday, Michigan, yes, right?
Rapids.
And, right. So we have these concerns that are still there. And here's what's really important, Areva, for you and your audience to hear. You can reform and reduce crime at the same time.
Thank you. Yes, you can.
They are not mutually exclusive.
Yes.
You can do both of them. In fact, if you want to reduce crime, we need to do reform in policing, i.e., what is it that we want police to do? Because we can't have them do everything. So when we look at advancing, which is the terminology I have replaced in front of reform, how do we advance policing in this 21st century? We advancing through the utilization of better technology to help us fight crime and build relationships in our community. We also take a look at what is it that we want police to do in our nation? What do we want them to do in our cities? Do we really want them out making traffic stops over frivolous traffic stops? Or do I really want them out there in the prevention mode? Because policing was designed to be a preventative measure for public safety, right?
I'm glad you brought that. Let me stop you on this traffic stop, because that is Patrick Lyoya, 26 years old, traffic stop over some kind of expired car registration. We don't really even know the details of that. What should have been not even a stop, as you said, do you want police stopping people for that? But let's assume he does. That escalates in 10, 15 seconds. And now 26-year-old black man shot in the head, Cedric. I mean, it's just Philando Castile, Walter Scott, Dante Wright. I mean, we can just call the roll on these routine traffic stops that just escalate so quickly.
Right.
And we're not hearing about those reforms. Like maybe cops are going to stop stopping people for expired tags. And that's what's getting lost in this piece that's really troubling. And meanwhile, here's another black man dead that should not be dead because of an expired registration.
You know, these types of encounters, we're going to have to take a look at. And regardless of who's at fault in the end, whether there's a cop fired or not, whether a cop is charged or not, whatever the case may have to be, we know that these type of events too frequently always have a bad ending. So we have a responsibility as citizens, as police leaders across this country, to take a look at the totality of all of that, right? And determine what is it that we need to do different in these encounters. And part of this is that we got to look at the whole thing from beginning to end, because there's shared responsibility in this, in everything that we do, right? So this is going to be investigated by Michigan State Police. I am confident that Governor Whitmer is going to oversee this and make sure that everyone's involved is going to be treated fairly and with balance under these circumstances. And so regardless of whatever the outcome may happen to be, criminally, civilly, or whatever the case may be, what we have to take a look at is how do we reduce, minimize, negate these type of encounters from the beginning, period. Because some of them certainly continues to create these types and set up these types of scenarios that really should not be set up at all.
So Cedric, you've been at this a long time and you've seen shifts in crime, you've seen shifts in narrative, but it seems like as a country, we just are so unimaginative when it comes to addressing crime. And when there is a shift because of a pandemic or a recession or whatever may be causing that shift, we resort back to this notion, put more police officers on the street, do more aggressive policing, which we know is code for racial profiling in a lot of cases. How do we break that cycle? Because I feel like we're just going right back into that same cycle that we keep repeating. LA Police, one of the candidates for mayor here, wants to put 1,500 additional cops on the street, not talking at all about community policing, building relationships, gang intervention programs, putting money into schools, putting money into summer jobs programs, none of that. Let's just this law and order. Let's start cracking some heads and locking basically some brothers up. I mean, that's what.
Well, the bottom line, if it's that basic and fundamental, I will assure you it's not going to work. And the data points that out. Merely hiring more police does not reduce crime. Only two things going to reduce crime in this country today. It's the utilization of technology that's coming on board that we can use to help fight crime. And it's also police departments building relationships in communities. That is the only way you are going to fight and reduce crime in this country.
And when you talk about technology, Cedric, what is that? Is that like being able to map areas with GPS?
It's so much emerging technology. That's a whole nother show by itself. But body camera technology is a useful tool, and not just for filming what I've done, but also for filming when you send me to de-escalation training, Chief Areva, I need to come back and employ those skills on the street. So I, as your supervisor, need to take your body camera footage and take a look at that domestic you just went to and say, hey, Officer Cedric, you did a great job. You did good here, there, and the other. You're reinforcing positive behavior. Or you're saying you're using that technology to say, hey, Cedric, here's what you could have done a little better. You see what I'm saying? So you're not just sending people the training where they check the box and go back to doing what they were doing, but we're building into the culture a different, it becomes part of the evaluation process, if you will. And then there's other crime mapping technology. There's facial recognition technology. It just goes on and on and on. That's evolving every day, but you got to find what's good for your community.
You're the only person I've seen, and I'm on the news all day, every day, either on my phone or I'm talking on the news. I don't hear people saying, let's get more money for technology. I'm hearing, again, this fallback, this default, let's get more bodies on the street. Why aren't more chiefs talking about? You just identified what sounds like some really amazing technology.
Well, it is, the technology is out there. That's a piece of it. But here again, the other piece, you got to build relationships in your community. You can bring on 1,500, 15,000 if you want to. If you don't change your modus operandi, nothing is going to be different. The literature points that out. Hiring more police does not reduce crime. What will reduce crime is hiring police that is better trained, connected to the community, and building those relationships that help solve crimes. And in addition to that, utilization of technology and all other resources that are available to you in your community. If you take the case just yesterday, Frank James being caught in New York City, he called in on himself because you had a community there in New York where he had 10 million people looking for him, right? 10 million people. Communities come together. It was a horrific crime. We should be like this all the time, but community come together. Hey, I'm over here. I got a low cell amount of energy on my cell phone. Come pick me up because these streets are starting to look dangerous for me. 10 million people were looking at it.
His world was getting smaller and smaller.
And smaller every day.
Yeah. Again, Cedric's book is In Defense of Public Service. Always great to hear you and have you on. I'm thinking about what you said in terms of those relationships. I don't know if you saw this case. I'm going to have this officer on, Black officer, undercover in St. Louis during one of the riots, or not riot, let me retract that word, doing a protest. They called it a riot. That's why I'm using the word, because that's what they called. This is what the police called it to justify their action, but it was a protest. He's undercover. They beat him up badly. The police beat him up badly. He goes to, there's a civil trial. I guess it was a federal hate. He's charged with federal hate crimes, that the officers involved. And it comes out that these officers involved in this attack on this undercover, their fellow officer, the N-word, all through these text messages, just berating these protesters, calling them. So this is who this guy works with. This is his co-worker that he's out on the streets with. And they beat him up so brutally. Then they lied about it, cover up, and 4 or 5 officers were charged. It's just horrific. And so I was like,
it's shameful to it's shameful to the public safety community.
It's shameful. I'm going to have him on the show. I just want to talk with him, but he's got to leave St. Louis. He's got to change his whole life. I mean, his whole world turned upside down by the people he works with. I mean, they beat that guy almost to the point of death. I mean, he barely survived the beating and then lied about it. And then lo and behold, they have such racial animus towards African Americans, as evidenced by how they're communicating with each other. But I'll have to have you back when I have him on. But thank you so much, Cedric. Always good to see you. I got it now, and he's going to bang up on our president. But all right, Richard Greene, media political strategist, author of the Words That Shook the World. I needed you back because we got to talk about the shifting narrative. And you are a strategist. You're a media guy. You help shape messages. We're heading into the midterms. The swing to the right is clear, whether you turn on a cable station or a network, or you go to a streaming site. It's this sensationalized crime headlines, and it's resonating in lots of communities. Lots of Democratic, wealthy, voters are starting to say, well, maybe we do need the tough on crime Republican. Maybe we do need to shift back to more cops on the street, more racial profiling, more lock them up, throw away the key strategies. How do we fight that?
I told you you're going to like some of what I say, and you're going to really not like some of what I'm going to say.
Go ahead, tell me, Richard.
I think we embrace it, and we learn from Eric Adams' success, and we do everything we can between now and November 8th to not alienate independent voters and even Republican voters and even some Democratic voters. The truth is, there is a perception, whether it's real or not, but perception is reality. There is a perception that crime is increasing. And in fact, I have a friend who's constantly telling me, oh my God, I was in Beverly Hills at a restaurant, and some people were saying that this gang came in and stole this very expensive, wristwatch. So those reports, I've lived in LA a long time. I've never heard that before. I do think it's likely, Areva, that crime is increasing because people have been going crazy in isolation and confinement with lockdowns and quarantines and fear about COVID. And human beings are social animals. We need to be with other people. And when you have the better part of 2 years where people have not been, I think that we're seeing a rise in mental illness and just people going off. And whether they do it by forming, a gang to have that social closeness, it's like, wow, I'm part of a gang, I'm back. And then that leads to more violence, or because people economically are hurting because of the pandemic. But bottom line, I do think that crime likely is increasing, that there is a perception, which is even more important, that crime is increasing, and that the Eric Adams approach, I'm a cop, I'm tough on crime, and I'm also a vegan, and I'm going to deal with climate change and police reform and all these other things. I think that's our wheelhouse, and we can't let Republicans take it.
Yeah, and I hear you. And Eric definitely leaned into that message, and he was successful. Now he is the mayor of New York City. I worry, though, because one of the things I'm starting to hear from the activist community is they feel like the Dem candidates are, kowtowing to that demographic, right? That is afraid of crime, and that they are afraid of, this perception that has been painted, this picture of crime, and that they are stepping away from their base. They're in many ways turning their back on the base. And we know as Democrats, if you don't have a large base turnout, and we've seen that, right, with Hillary Clinton, if the Black and brown activists who have been in the streets for months or were in the streets for months after George Floyd, if they feel like, hey, we voted for the Dems, and now the Dems sound just like the Republicans, and they're going to sit it out. They're not going to vote for the Republicans. They just won't vote. Dems can't afford that either.
So we have a number of problems. One is part of our base is really pissed off about COVID lockdowns. The anti-vax part of the Democratic base, which sounds exactly like the far-right Trump supporters on the Republican Party. So it's this incredibly bizarre, unholy alliance where a lot of people who would naturally vote for Democrats who are part of our base, they're going to stay home or they're going to vote for Republicans, because they're really pissed off about the lockdowns. But I want to refer you back to our old friend, Abraham Maslow. And the truth is, we've got so many things we want to do in this country that are higher up on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But the bottom one that will always win, the first chakra, the fight or flight response for human beings, it's always safety and security. And that is how the Republican Party, with the war on drugs and let's get tough on crime, that's how they have won thousands of elections. And so why would we surrender that to them when we Democrats, we also want people not to be killed, walking into a subway. We also want people to be able to enjoy their lunch or dinner at a restaurant in Beverly Hills without having their watch be stolen right off their wrist. And I don't know why we would do anything, including reinforcing something that was, Areva, I think you would agree on this, incredibly harmful to our brand as Democrats, even though I understand it and I agree with it, and you understand it and you agree with it, but the defund the police theme has been toxic and deadly for our Democratic Party. And we have to do everything we can to balance that out and say, we're not for defunding the police. In fact, we're for increasing funding, but in different creative ways, just like your previous guest was talking about. I mean, those two things, technology and creating community relationships, let's fund the heck out of those.
But here's the problem, Richard. You're right. The defund the police slogan, like the word woke, became so politicized, like critical race theory, they've all become toxic terms, and the Republicans, essentially made that happen. The base,
yes, they're good at that.
They're good at that. They did that. They took those terms and turned them into like horrible things to say or be affiliated with. But the base, Richard, the base isn't hearing what you just said. the base isn't hearing, yes, I care about crime. Yes, I have a black son. I don't want my son beat up or killed by the police, and nor do I want to be robbed in my car or going to my home. So yes, Democrats care about crime too, but we also care about criminal justice reform. And the conversation right now has shifted so that we're not having those conversations about reform. And when we see another black man, like in Grand Rapids, that gets killed because he has a expired registration or whatever, it just reinforces that reform message has been so buried and so lost that it starts to make the base worried that
Right.
we're sounding like the Republicans. And if we sound like the Republicans, we're going to act like the Republicans. So why vote for these guys? I'm staying.
So-
I'm apathetic. All of them are crooks. All of them lie. None of them do anything they say they're going to do. So why vote?
So we have to grow a pair. Those of us who, not me, but people who are saying those things, and people who are being very critical, and people who will not vote. Let me say two things that people need to understand, including exactly those people. Number one, we don't have the votes for police reform in the United States Congress. We don't have the votes. We just don't have the votes. So Cory Booker and Tim Scott, they're working. But because of Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, we need 60 votes. We need 60 votes, which means we need 10 Republicans to join with this quote unquote now categorized as a woke movement for police reform. The only way we're going to accomplish that, and every Democrat is in favor, almost every Democrat is in favor of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and the really important reforms that we need to make. The only way that can happen nationally is by replacing Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin and electing at least 2 more Democrats who are willing to create carve-outs for police reform and voting rights and climate change and other things that most people want in the filibuster rule. Until we nuke the filibuster rule or create or have a willingness to create carve-outs, nothing is going to get done. And instead, what we're going to be doing by staying home is if we lose 1 seat in the Senate, 1 seat, we lose 1 seat, Mitch McConnell is going to be majority leader. You think he's going to bring the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act up for a vote?
And Kevin McCarthy in the House.
Or Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump is very likely to be Speaker of the House of Representatives if Republicans pick up 5 more seats.
Thank you for that sobering and very honest reminder, Richard. But let me ask you this. No, that was.
But we got to vote. We got to vote.
Right.
I don't care. There's a binary choice. A binary choice. Democrats may suck, but Republicans suck more. Okay, that's the bottom line.
And we don't have the choice of not voting because you're right. You may not love Nancy, but you are gonna hate Kevin. And you may not love Chuck, but oh my God,
he makes my skin crawl.
Yeah,
Kevin McCarthy. Oh my God.
I know that's horrible. But help us, Richard. Us being Dems as a whole, how do we talk reform? Because we got to talk reform, or I'm afraid as much as you and I tell that base they must vote, they're not going to. And we've seen it before. How do we talk reform and evidence a willingness to do whatever? I don't like tough on crime, but do whatever is necessary to make sure that we reduce crime, hopefully using the methods that Cedric talked about, because the Republicans paint the Dems as soft on crime when they talk reform. When you have district attorneys who say, I don't want to, charge people for low-level nonviolent misdemeanors. I don't want to put 16-year-old kids in jail for snatching a purse. That they then become the soft on crime, as you call them, woke,
right.
Dems, do nothing Dems that are going to let people rob you and, steal your car and beat your wife and all these horrible things.
And that was the whole game in the Ketanji Brown Jackson. By the way, congratulations, right? we have a Black woman on the Supreme Court, and as a white Jewish male, I am just deliriously happy about that. Can I say that?
Fabulous. Yes. Thank you. Yes.
But it could be the very last one that we have in a long time. And I can talk about that in a second. But the answer, Areva, is exactly what your previous guest said, which is let's be proactive, not defensive. So yes, we care about crime. Let's talk about spending money to increase, technology, spending money with police departments to increase community relationships. There's nothing more important than having young Black men actually know policemen and say, hey man, how you doing? High five, right? I mean, that's the community that we want all over the country. But the Ketanji Brown Jackson was incredibly revealing. They knew they were going to lose, right? The Republicans knew where they were going to lose, but they said, you know what? We get to do the Democrats are soft on crime thing. The whole set of hearings was about her giving reduced sentences, soft on crime sentences for pedophiles. Man, they just got a lot. They lost the battle, but they may win the war because now yet another Democrat on the Supreme Court who loves pedophiles, who doesn't care about crime. I mean, it's
you're right. And they rolled that. It was the most performative, hearing we've ever seen. They got some talking points and they just repeated them over and over and over again.
They know how to do this. You know why they know how to do this? Because they've got nothing else. There are no real policy proposals that the Republican Party has that are supported by a majority of the American people. None.
So
none.
You're right. So, okay, Richard, what you just said made a lot of sense. Yes, we can talk about reform. We can talk about smart policing, right? Not tough on crime, but smart policing, technology, community relationships. We can dispel the myth that just putting cops on the street and banging heads reduces crime. The media doesn't want to talk about that, Richard. All the media wants to show, which is what my first guest talked about, was some woman getting chased by some kids or whatever. And yeah, that's bad. And I feel sorry for that woman. I wouldn't want that to be me, my friends. I didn't want it to be that woman. But let's face it, that ain't the worst thing that happens to people in the neighborhood because it's a white woman in a white neighborhood. The media just runs with that. And that's whether it's so-called liberal media or the conservative media. So I can't even give the liberal media a pass either because they are wearing this crime narrative into the ground. And they're not talking the reform narrative that we were talking about 6 months ago.
I agree with. So I think there are two separate issues. One is Fox News and the conservative media. It always is shocking to me that no matter what is going on in the country or the world, the leading story on Fox News is some person got robbed or knocked over or beaten up or whatever. Again, it's Maslow. It's just get people afraid, and then they're going to vote in the way you want them to vote. Yeah. But on the flip side of that, we need to have Rachel Maddow and Chuck Todd and everybody on MSNBC and CNN and so many other places, because not that many people watch those cable networks, even if we do, talking about this proactive increase the funding to the police departments, but do it in a super smart way, right? I think we have to own that message and we have to drum it, every single day. And maybe there needs to be some connection between, Democratic candidates and progressive media to say, hey, we get it. We're going to talk about the things people care about, not the things that they don't care about, so that they at least can elect us and be open to hearing from us about the other things. So again, it all comes down to voting. I think the Democrats suck at messaging, and therefore we're not getting people out to vote, and we're on defense, and we should not be on defense. We have everything America wants. Why are we not on offense?
What's the simple way to combat the soft on crime jacket that Republicans try to put on Dems? Is there like a alternative, cool way that we can talk about it? Because their messages are always pretty concise, law and order, soft on crime. So do we have some words? I don't know if you're a wordsmith and, maybe this is putting you on the spot, but I'm just thinking like, what can our message be that's simple, that's not complicated, that we can hopefully get our stations that are, more pro-democratic. And you're right, cable news has such a small audience, definitely not a young person's audience. If you're 35 and under, you don't even know. You said Rachel Maddow and Chuck Todd. My daughter's saying, who? What?
Yeah, exactly.
Give us like some words. Like, what can we say?
Yeah. So here's the thing. I think that we have to play defense and offense. So the defense is, no, we're not soft on crime, right? We just elected a police officer who's really tough on crime as a Democratic mayor of the largest city in our country, right? Overwhelming support by Democrats, right? We're not about open borders, right? We need to dispel that myth. We're not about defunding the police. So that's the defense. But the offense is we're for creative solutions. We're for modern solutions. We're for new solutions. We're for putting more money than's ever been put into police departments. So we have to reverse the spin of the defund the police, and exactly the things that as I said, your previous guest said. Here's the technology that Democrats are putting forward. Just like, Trump said, let's build a wall, and Democrats were saying, no, let's do drones, let's do new technology. So I think that's a message that resonates really well. We're progressive. We're the forward-thinking party. We've got progressive, creative, high-tech solutions that will make you safer. And we have to address it head on. And I think we can.
Yeah, that was so refreshing to hear Cedric say that. But honestly, have you heard any Democratic candidates? I haven't heard any.
Well, I think Eric talked about this, and as a cop on the street, right, he understands the importance of community policing. I think we've got to focus on what Eric has done. I think he's a compelling guy. I've met him. He's incredibly charming and fun, and I love that he's a vegan. I think we need to make him, this former police officer, and a successful political candidate, one of the faces of the Democratic Party, and not Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah, for me, the jury's out on Eric. I was in New York watching him give an exemption to athletes and entertainers for vaccinations while he was firing rank and file city employees who make $40,000, $50,000 a year, sending them home while giving people who make $50 million a year a pass not to get vaccinated. Real problems with that.
So I have a question for you, Areva. Have you always liked everything about your boyfriends or husbands or parents?
Yes, Richard, I have. And you didn't listen to me because I said the jury is still out, and I was telling you why the jury is out. Let me finish. I was going to agree with you. Eric is a model of success, and we're trying to win. And no, you don't have to like everything about a candidate. And I like the fact that Eric cut through and won.
Right.
And that's what we're trying to do in these midterms, whether it's at the congressional level or the Senate level. We're trying to cut through and win.
Let me just address that. And it's great, because we've got to be less perfectionistic, right? There is no perfect candidate, right?
Dems, right? We've got to be we're way too overly perfectionist. I agree with that. We want everything.
It's kind of like my daughter. She's single, and it's like, why not? Well, he's too short. It's like, come on. At some point, you have to make a choice. Well, you don't have to make a choice on that, but we have a binary choice in politics. And here's the thing that people need to understand: we have 2 years potentially to get this stuff done. Because if we lose the White House, and I think Ron DeSantis is looking unbelievably strong, if we lose the White House in 2024, we've lost 4 years to get anything that we care about done, right? And then even if we win the White House back if we keep the White House in 2024, or we win it back in 2028, we have to, in order to pass this, we have to have 50 Democrats in the United States Senate who are willing to change the filibuster rules. That's not easy. And we have to retake or hold, 218 members in the House. So it's this term in politics called the trifecta, right? We have a trifecta, but we don't have the 2 extra people we need to activate on that trifecta by overcoming the filibuster. If we don't do it in this election, meaning not just not lose, but not lose and add two more Democratic senators who have the guts to actually do what it takes to pass these things, we may not be able to pass anything literally for 4, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 years. Not to mention, do you really think that Mitch McConnell is going to allow Joe Biden, if he is Senate Majority Leader, to nominate someone to replace Clarence Thomas who is anything close to acceptable?
Absolutely not. He's made that very clear. If he takes over again as Senate Majority Leader, there will be no judicial Supreme Court nominations. If 3 of them could die, not
right.
Death on any.
Right. And we could be looking at an 8-1 very hard right Supreme Court for a really long time. Right?
I mean, it's real. The partisanship in this country is real. And I was at the reception for Ketanji Brown Jackson, and I sat next to, it was so beautiful, wonderful. But I sat next to a guy who works at the Brennan Center, and he does a lot of voting rights work, think tank. And he said, he says their polling, their analysis, the House, in their estimation, is gone.
It's not.
And he thinks that the Senate is close. You're more optimistic. I'm glad. That was.
Well, I'm the only one. I'm the only one in the country that's optimistic, and I'll tell you why. Because I know, again, the bottom line for me is you've got to teach how to play the game of politics. You've got to teach civics. There will be 120 million Americans, largely young people and people of color, who will not vote. If we could just educate, and I've been working on this really hard, if we can just educate people who are going to stay home about what we have just talked about, which is this may be our last chance to have another Ketanji Brown Jackson. This may be our last chance for police reform, our last chance for climate change, and we need you to vote. If we could just increase the vote of the 120 million who won't vote by 10%. If we can get 12 extra million people, we can win. Tim Ryan can win. Raphael Warnock can win.
Well, yeah, and I want to kind of take exception to what you said, Richard, about people of color not voting. People of color, particularly African Americans, punch above their weight, which is why Raphael
women do.
Warnock,
older women totally do.
We lost black men to Trump in the last president. Not all black men, but we lost a portion, a small portion, to Republicans. But I agree with you that overall, we've got to get those people who are less inclined to vote to understand what's at stake. I'm out of time, Richard. I always enjoy sitting down talking with you. This is such fascinating.
Likewise.
I mean, we're not talking about hypotheticals and theoreticals, because primaries are happening now as we speak. They will happen through the summer. And then final elections are less than 6 months away. So we're going to know.
Yeah, I mean, the mail-in voting process starts in about 6 months. You're right. No, this is all hands on deck, and it's a binary choice. It's a binary choice, people. I don't care how much you don't like some of the things Democrats do. Weigh the alternative, and it's an easy choice.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard. Always a pleasure to see you. Always great insights. Appreciate you so much.
Take care. Richard, likewise.
Cedric and Chief Rhambo for joining me this morning. Really interesting conversation. Yeah, Richard is right. We don't always agree, but we definitely agree on this. This is a binary choice, and this crime narrative, you've got to look past it. You cannot let it cripple you with fear. Yes, crime is real. Yes, we have witnessed it on television. Some of the things that have been written about in the paper, they're real, and I don't want to dismiss them or make people think I don't care about crime, because I do. My family, we have victims of crime, murders that have happened to family members. So I know firsthand how horrible it is to experience, whether it's a violent crime like a shooting death, which I've experienced in my family, or property loss, or whatever crime that may be. So it's real. But the answer is not what the Republicans are selling. They are not selling solutions to crime. Putting more officers on the street. You heard it from Cedric. Cedric is one of the most renowned law enforcement experts in this country. That is not the solution. Do not fall prey to this law and order rhetoric, because that's all it is. And underneath a lot of it is racist tropes. It's a throwback to this time and this era, even that we live in today, where Black people, Black men in particular, are painted as dangerous and violent criminals that need to be locked up forever. So we have to be smarter. We have to be more discerning. We have to use good judgment. And we have to, as Richard said, we've got to vote, most importantly. Just my words to live by before I get out. The definition of insanity is to keep doing the same thing the same way and expecting a different result. We can't keep resorting to what we've done in this country, which is lock people up, throw away the key, hire more officers. It doesn't work, doesn't solve the crime issue, and it definitely doesn't address the racial disparities that are replete throughout our criminal justice system. We've got to get more imaginative. We've got to get more creative. We've got to get smarter about how to reduce crime while at the same time continue to work on those reforms so that we don't have to bury yet another Black man like Patrick, who's killed in Grand Rapids simply because maybe, we don't even know for sure, but maybe his license plate or his registration had expired. That should not be a death sentence in this country. I'm out. Y'all be safe out there. Remember, we're all in this together. Don't forget to register for the Special Needs Network Social Justice Conference coming up on April 30th. It's free. We're going to be talking about these issues with some of the nation's leading experts. Hope to see you there.